conference participants. I am excited to be joining you this coming Friday to talk about some of the different ways that the current political moment opens up a policy window to go green fast. And in particular, what my memo tries to do is to explore some ways in which the particular form that the Inflation Reduction Act took in the United States opens up some policy windows, potentially on both sides of the Atlantic. This is top of mind for me as I'm just coming back from visits to the UK and EU, where policymakers are attempting to grapple with what the Inflation Reduction Act is really all about, and what are some of the reasons that the U.S. took the approach that it did, and what are some of the opportunities to work with the U.S. or compete with the U.S. At this moment. So my memo looks at some of the reasons that the U.S. took a carrot-heavy approach as opposed to a sticks-only approach or a carrot-and-sticks approach for responding to the climate crisis. One key factor is the timing of when the U.S. has been taking action after it's had the opportunity to study and absorb some of what worked and what didn't work about the carbon pricing focused approaches that have been put in place in different places around the world. Because the U.S. has had opportunity to sort of see some of the failings of a price-focused, stick-focused approach, the U.S. has the benefit of designing its own strategy in ways that are responsive and learn from those experiences. Another key factor was the political veto points in the United States. Part of the reason the U.S. has not taken climate action is because of the veto points in the U.S. Senate. This carrots-focused approach allows the U.S. to get around that problem by essentially doing for the climate what we did for the defense industrial complex in the Cold War, which is by having defense jobs and defense dollars in every single congressional district, you create a constituency against rollback of defense appropriations. Similarly, I think the case with the Inflation Reduction Act is to try to have climate jobs and climate dollars in every congressional district. And so, despite the fact that no Republicans supported the IRA, you now increasingly have Republican members of Congress and Republican governors touting the benefits of the policy for their home states, which is kind of exactly politically how you would want the thing to work in order to guard against rollback of the kind that we saw with Trump pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, for instance. In our own research at the Roosevelt Institute, we estimate that upwards of 60% of the green supply chain opportunities are going to be in congressional districts that are held by Republicans. So look for some policy feedback and policy lock-in there. A final thing I would point to is that there's some legal strictures that push the U.S. in the direction that it did. In particular, the fact that while the Supreme Court regularly rules against environmental regulation, it actually has never, in over 230 years, ruled against a federal tax and spending bill. So, with Biden having one shot, you want to take a shot that is more likely to survive court review, and I think the early indications is the IRA will do that. So then, what does this mean for Europe? The initial reaction out of Europe has been pretty negative, I would say, but that obscures, maybe more than it illuminates. One is that while Europeans have claimed to be surprised by some of the provisions in the IRA, their European Commission delegation has been lobbying against the Inflation Reduction Act in the Build Back Better Act for well over a year, and has been successful in eliminating some provisions like the top up on tax credits for unionized facilities. There's also just been, I think, a parsing of different normal implementation moments of like a bill becoming a law, then it becoming implemented, then there being requests for comments on regulation. Basically, at every step of that, there's been some in Europe that have used that as an opportunity to gin up additional criticism and anxiety. Even though really like this is just part of like one kind of continual process that's been ongoing. And if you parse some of the objections to the IRA, it almost looks like they're looking for the Biden administration to violate U.S. law or the separation of powers by rolling back things that were duly passed in Congress. So I think that's going to be, that has proven to be a non-starter, and I think it will continue to be a non-starter in Washington. But I think there are a few reasons for hope that I go into in my memo, and a few sort of policy windows that allow for deeper transatlantic cooperation going forward. One is that I think that, there has been work done over the last number of years to sort of learn from the lessons of COVID, learn from some of the rising inequality that's happened on both sides of the Atlantic, to do deeper international cooperation, sort of with equity and sustainability in mind. You've seen that in some of the G7 declarations and the G7 panel on economic resilience, that where both policymakers and experts came to some pretty significant transatlantic consensus on reforms to the multilateral trading system, reform of international economic institutions. You've seen that with the historic OECD agreement on boosting minimum corporate tax around the world. So there's, above and beyond sort of the specific climate trade space, there's been some successful ground setting since Biden came into office. There's second, some discrete arenas for cooperation where there's been some early positive signs. The global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum is one here, where the US and EU agreed to basically create a plurilateral docking mechanism in trade law parlance to do ambitious sectoral decarbonization in highly traded, highly emitting sectors like steel and aluminum. That was announced in October 2021, and negotiations are continuing through October 2023 of this year. And if that works, I think that will be a good template for ways to do sectoral cooperation in other spaces. Third, I think there's just more generally a race to the top dynamic that some of the squabbling over the subsidies obscures. Namely, that I don't think you would have had the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum without the carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal in the EU. I don't think you would have had the Inflation Reduction Act without some of the policies that Europe has embraced, and the Made in China 2025 package. That in particular really changed the policy conversation in Washington in favor of a more robust industrial policy in both parties, actually. And so, and then I think even most recently with the IRA, now you see the EU responding with a Green Deal industrial fund that could potentially replicate some of the things that worked in the scale of the IRA. And I think that those arenas are really just kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of arenas for cooperation. I think that you've seen the European Union now propose the idea of commodity clubs to deal with scarce minerals needed for the economic transition. That's actually a very Rooseveltian era kind of idea that if you look at the original text of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, there were carve-outs for commodity clubs precisely because it was thought that would be one way that countries would cooperate when it came to natural resource management. It was a way that was actually very common in World War I and World War II. So there was a history there, but that history has kind of been obscured, in the intervening decades where that kind of thing has fallen out of fashion. So in short, I think that there's a lot of arenas for cooperation at the sectoral level, using some of these tried and true methods from the past that have sort of been lost, but could be recovered. Anyway, with that, looking forward to our chat on Friday and more soon.